like in world, I'm sure it's a little bit awkward because it's like you're speaking your spell, and then they go no spell, and you, while talking about this spell, you say no spell, and
it's lore accurate. That's the verbal component.
That's the incantation. You just go no spell.
No spell.
No
spell.
Welcome to Monsters and Multiclass, your Dungeons & Dragons fix. I'm Elioti.
I'm Jared Bornagle.
I'm Will Meldon.
And on this episode, we are taking a look at the newish book, Monsters of the Multiverse. We're kind of taking like a holistic look at the monsters, sort of covering the more grander design changes that this book seems to be showing, and we'll highlight a few differences between some monsters we covered and some new ones as well. That kind of highlights that stuff well, and give our opinions on it. Let's get into it.
Yeah, and to do that, so we're going to be focusing on 3 monsters. Maybe we'll pull up some more, but these were ones that we kind of prepared. The Alhoon, a mind flayer that we've covered in the past, which I'll do the wavy hands bit. Demogorgon, which we've also covered in the past. And then a Caneloth, or the Caneloths, that we have not covered. But it is a Yugoloth. So starting off, if to give at least some context, if for some reason you've been under a rock the past couple of months, Monsters of the Multiverse is a monster book that took the monsters from Volo's Guide to Monsters and Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes and smushed them into one book with redesigned stat blocks for a more modern D&D experience. The book was a part of a physical set, a collector set that had, I believe, what books were in there?
I want to say it's Xanathar's and Tasha's.
That sounds right. Xanathar's, Tasha's. Yeah, it was like the extended collectors.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because like the base is Player Handbook, Dungeon Master Guide, and Monster Manual.
Monster Manual, right. Okay. So yeah, had that extended, those 3 books. And that came out in January of this year, but was only in physical print, and you needed to get that collector's edition. So it really didn't make much of a splash, I feel like, until it had its actual release on May 17th.
Yes, you could buy it by itself.
Yes, you could buy it by itself. And we also found out that Wizards of the Coast was taking both Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes and Volo's Guide to Monsters off of the shelves, more or less, the digital shelves at the very least, so that you can no longer purchase them on D&D Beyond, and they are now considered legacy content. So, we're not going to talk about that entire controversy. That's not really what we cover. But it is definitely a topic of discussion, because this is them making a clear statement that this is the monster design going forward. And unless there's some radical change, I don't see that just being upended anytime soon.
Right. And this is most likely all in preparation for, in 2024, their teased new version. I doubt it's going to be 6th edition, maybe like a 5.5 or like a new backwards compatible player handbook. It's a little fuzzy still. We don't have any secret inside details, but it seems to be kind of coming out in preparation for that. Yeah,
and so some of the major changes that we've seen are around things like spellcasting, and I think that'll be a good way to start with the Alhoon, because this is probably one of the biggest changes. A major switch has been that the spellcasters in the game are really... they're stripped down of the complicated nature of spellcasting. Usually, if it gives you a 12th level spellcaster, or whatever, I guess, what is an Alhoon usually? It is a...
Oh, I have it up. 12th, yep.
Oh, okay.
Hey, what do you know?
Usually, if you have a 12th level spellcaster, you'll get spells, all the spell slots with different spells that they can cast at those spell levels. And of course, if you want to, as the DM, you can upcast and do anything. I mean, it's basically like a PC spellcaster in your hands. And, looking at the Alhoon, say it is a 12th level spellcaster in the Volo's Guide to Monsters book, and has a lot of different spells. We've got everything from, say, 1st to 6th, and has our Detect Magic, Disguise Self, Magic Missile, Shield, all pretty common spellcasting spells to have, and very much in combat utility, all the way up to things like Disintegrate and Globe of Invulnerability. So this usually made for a quite a complicated fight to run. But looking at, again, how some of these things have been reworked, what we've got now is really just once per day abilities that are spellcasting and are labeled as such. And some of these spells are now taken out of the spell casting, turned into monster abilities, and we completely remove the spell slot concept. So no more upcasting, no more variable casting.
Basically replaced all of it with innate spellcasting. A lot of monsters did have that, where you would see it like they could do these at will and this one time a day and this 3 times a day. It's basically replaced all of them with that.
Yeah, so looking at the Alhoons, the once per day spells that they have, we're going from a list of, if I just had to pick a number, looking like 15 or so spells that they knew previously. Now they have once per day: Dominate Monster, Globe of Invulnerability, Invisibility, Modify Memory, Plane Shift, and Wall of Force. Couple at-will spells: Dancing Light, Detect Magic, Detect Thoughts, Disguise Self, Mage Hand, and Prestidigitation. So all spells that just kind of, the at-will ones are, they're flavorful, probably not going to be used in combat much. And the once per day spells are more on the higher level side. Like, I mean, we don't get stuff like Lightning Bolt in there, which was a 3rd level spell that the Alhoon had. We don't have a Scorching Ray in there.
Don't have Shield.
Yeah.
Anymore. I feel like that kind of really changes, like the Alhoon fight specifically, because it doesn't have a high AC, only 15, and that doesn't change.
Yeah, so it's going to be much easier to hit. And we see that a couple times this is offset, at least by giving more HP. This has 150 HP compared to the Volo's Guide to Monsters 120. And that, I think, across the board is seen as, more HP is given. In this case, a fly speed was given as well with a hover. It's not a quick fly speed, it's just 15 feet. But that, I'm assuming, is to get around the need for the fly spell.
And to a lesser extent, the at-will levitate.
Yes, and the at-will levitate. Good point.
The Volos version had one of that?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Oh, we also had, okay. The Volos also had innate spellcasting. It had both.
Yeah, a little bit confusing.
Yeah.
This is actually why it's just such a good pick to kind of focus on what the hell happened in this book. It's just like, it was kind of a messy train wreck, and it continues to be a messy train wreck of ideas.
But we can see, I mean, there is some simplification there. I mean, say getting rid of the fly spell and just giving them a fly speed is simpler. There's no arguing there. You now have one less concentration ability to focus on. If the Alhoon needs to fly, go ahead, make them fly.
Right. Just a little more limited. This is 15, but it's a hover, blah, blah, blah. I think fly speed hovers too. So
go ahead.
I'd say, with just this, so before we get into the spells that became baked in abilities, I'm so split on what I think of these type of changes, because I've definitely DM'd like spellcasters like the Alhoon, not specifically the Alhoon, but where it has, it's a 15th level caster. Here's 7th level spells and slots, and rarely you throw something like that alone. So it's like with other monsters and trying to keep track of them all and keep track of the spell slots, I always found kind of difficult. And combat always got pretty slow when that monster came up, unless I had something pre-planned, which a lot of times doesn't really work out because your party throws wrenches and things, as they should. Trying to go through and remember the specifics of the spells and needing to be ready for it. So in that sense, I kind of like this change because it is more simplified, but it is also definitely then a power decrease because it doesn't have the versatility. It doesn't have the ability to upcast. You can't like spam a spell that's going to work really well against your party and make that a challenge for them to overcome because everything's just really once a day each. So I'm right on the fence. I think it would I could see going back and forth depending on the encounter and how I'm feeling that day if I'm going to use the legacy versions of these spellcasting monsters or the new one.
Yeah, I definitely think that it removes a lot of the unique feeling of fighting a spellcaster, because usually fighting a high level spellcaster, they have a specific spellcasting type. I mean, even just for example, I've thrown high level clerics against you guys, and I've thrown high level wizards or sorcerers, and to me they feel like extremely different fights, because on one side we've got stuff like spiritual weapons being thrown around and other buff spells from this high level cleric, and that's, you know, very much the focus. Whereas the shift that I'm seeing is more to just dealing consistent damage, and less about all of the versatility that comes from having that spell casting. So I'm right there with you in terms of it is much easier, and DMing high level spellcasters is hard. I mean, it really is. It's probably one of the biggest challenges for a new DM. And there's also a lot of weirdness when it comes to the challenge rating aspect, which is already a rough thing to work around and to understand. When you throw in the fact that, you know, a monster has disintegrate. Well, if it has disintegrate, where does that challenge rating sit? Because the amount of damage it can do is really, really high. It has the potential to outright kill a player without resurrection being an option. And I think when you pare back the spells, you get more control, and you get to fine tune the expected challenge. But I hate it. I do, because it's something that as I've run more high level spellcasters, they are almost always memorable fights, because there's so many options, because it's dynamic. The fight can change in an instant. You know, you're fighting a creature, and then a time stop comes through, and wow, how is that going to change the fight? I don't really expect those to be put into these types of stat blocks, because you're not going to be able to layer in as much if you don't have 10, 15 more spells to choose from. And that's obviously specific with time stop, but just that idea of, if a situation arises, you can do more with it. I mean, it's just like why people want to play spellcasters in the first place, right? Is being able to handle it in any particular way. Whereas this feels very much like, okay, the Alhoun fight needs to be structured in this specific way now, because it doesn't have all of these different spell slots and different ways to fight the party.
So I don't think the design choice to basically switch it all to innate spellcasting causes that. It's just the examples we've pulled up in this book and the ones we're familiar with do narrow things down, but it doesn't necessarily have to. Because they could have given the Alhoun 15 once-a-day spells.
It's true.
And it would have effectively been the same. You just lose that kind of ability to kind of recast things if the party counterspells or dispels it or what have you. And then maybe that is for the better, because then you're rewarding the party where it's like, oh, they counterspelled the big thing. It's like, that is done for the day. I don't get to just do it again next round and like, haha, fuck you, party. Which could feel, kind of frustrating. I guess that's really campaign table dependent if you like that kind of hardness to it. I do agree, though, based on what I keep seeing, not only are they switching it to the simplified innate spellcaster, and they're really, really paring down the list where it does feel like it loses some of that versatility.
Yeah, no, you bring up a great point. They very much could have just given a bunch of once per day abilities, and maybe you need to format it differently, because just putting 2 paragraphs of spells is hard to read through and hard to actually understand what's going on.
Maybe like divide it up by power levels, and
you could have like a number of per day. We could call them
right.
slots.
But I think what it ignores by taking away all of these things is that the true limit when you are running a spellcaster is around the amount of actions you're going to have. You're not going to be able to cast 15 different spells. So, maybe the Alhoun, for example, it has Disintegrate at 6th level. And okay.
Volos, yeah.
Yes, in Volos, thank you. And that's a once per day thing. So you have either Disintegrate or you have Globe of Invulnerability. You get to choose one of them. Or maybe you choose none of them because you want to cast confusion at 6th level and get the entire party in it. And once again, it's just like this is now a very dynamic fight, because maybe your party all has high dexterity and you're like, if I cast Disintegrate, that's going to be a waste of time. I don't want to deal with it. And instead of needing to homebrew a stat block every single time, thinking of which spells would possibly suit this party best and what do I need to construct to make this a good fight, it's all just kind of a template. So it took longer to learn, and that stinks. Like, nobody wants the game to take a while to learn, but man, I really feel like it's a lot more rewarding with these more spell slot options.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's totally fair. This is the versatility of upcast and picking what you use for a slot, things like that.
So in terms of some other changes as well, looking at stuff like the cantrips are removed, and I mean made into just the at-will abilities, but damage cantrips are specifically what are removed and turned into actions instead.
Right, and I think that's a much bigger change, and that's kind of seen throughout.
Yeah, and so in this case with the Alhoun, we have Chill Touch is removed and replaced instead with a Chilling Grasp. And
the Volos version has Chilling Grasp as well, and that's a melee spell attack. I think it's more Arcane Bolt.
Right. You're right. I'm sorry. You're totally right. And Arcane Bolt is actually the magic missile equivalent.
Right. Yeah, Arcane Bolt is just a ranged spell attack plus 8 to hit, 120 foot, 8d6 force damage.
Yes.
Which is kind of nuts.
It's quite a bit of damage, yeah.
Yeah. And they could do 2 Chilling Grasp, which has also been beefed up in this new one, where it's in Volos, it was just 3d6 cold damage. And Monsters of the Multiverse, it's 46 cold damage, and then the Alhoun regains 14 hit points. I'm not 100% sure what it's trying to... Like, it doesn't have any spells that's like an absorb hit point thing unless I'm missing it.
No,
that's
I think
like a common spell type anyways, but...
No, I think that's purely just to change and to make it feel a little beefier. Make up for the lack of
shield. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, finding other ways to get that longevity. Right.
And so these can't be counterspelled. That's the big change, and you've probably heard it if you've been on Twitter or any sort of D&D community right now. Since it's no longer spell casting, it's just part of their attack, part of their actions, and these specifically part of their counterattacks. Like, that's not a counterspellable thing. I don't think counterspellable is a word, but it's not able to be counterspelled.
You better hope it is, because we're going to say it about 30 more times this discussion. Right. So I think Arcane Bolt's the big one there, because whereas before, if that was a high-level magic missile being cast, that's something that could be counterspelled. Now it's, and that obviously changes up a lot with magic missile usually being something that could be split between different people, used to break concentration on PCs because it hits multiple times. Now we just have a single +8 to hit, and it either does a bunch of damage or it doesn't.
Right. And it's a high enough damage, it's something you'd want to counterspell, but you can't. So it in that sense, it definitely does take away some of that uniqueness, as you were saying, about when you fight spellcasters, because it's just another big damage hit. It's a ranged attack.
Yeah.
It could just be like a giant with a long bow.
Yeah.
Same sort of thing, just flavored a little different.
And that's where I really worry that a lot of these monsters are divulging into, where they are definitely easier to run. And I think it's pretty easy to say these are simpler to run. And that's overall probably a good thing. But I don't even know where I'm going with that. They also lose a lot of their flavor. And that I just would not want to put up with, because, looking at beasts, that's a monster type that I think has faced this issue for a very long time, where you look at 15 different beast stat blocks and you're like, what are the big differences between them? Well, this one has claws, so it does slashing damage. This one bites, so it does piercing damage. And this one has a charge ability, and it's like, well, they're all the same. Like, you're just fighting hit points that some have multi-attack, some don't. But if I'm fighting
slightly varying damage types, but
like a wolf versus a mammoth in a fight to the death, which I want to watch from a D&D perspective. The Mammoth's going to win, but either way, looking at their stat blocks, the only difference is the numbers. How much health does this one have? How much damage does this one do? Right. The wolf has pack tactics. One has trample or stomp, whatever it is. And that's where I feel like the spellcasters are kind of going as well. And I don't want that. I don't want them to feel pretty similar, except for, how much damage they do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of getting into one of the biggest problems with that type of thing is that it puts a hard ceiling on how difficult essentially the fight can be. When you have imagining a challenge rating 20 beast, it doesn't sound very fun. And in fact, that's one of the biggest complaints about like the Tarask. It's just like, oh, big number. Okay. And it's dull. Right. It's dull. And right. I don't want to see D&D. Like that's when high level stuff gets fun, when it gets really, really complicated. And the turn away from that seems ill-advised.
Yeah, and we've seen 5th edition really struggle to create high-level content, and I think a lot of it is because of that complicated nature. From a business perspective, I totally understand why this has been made. I understand why a new book that is simpler to run and is more accessible at higher levels, because you don't have it being this complicated counterspell battle back and forth, and whose reaction gets to go off first, and who cast it at which level, and depending on that, whose roles need to be sorted out. Like, I get it. I get that it's simpler. I do also feel like that's never been difficult for people to just not do if they don't want. Like, there are people who run low level stuff and they stick from 1 to 10 all the time. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I've interacted with in the community who tell me they have never played a character over level 7. And they're still enjoying the game. They're still buying new content. It hasn't stopped them from enjoying the game. To me, all this has done is make it harder for people who do want that crunchiness to go out and get it. Which, speaking of, one of these is the removal of counterspell from the stat block, and this is something that is a total universal change. You will not see a enemy having counterspell anymore.
So it's that absolute. I haven't looked through in that much detail. So you just get negate spell everywhere.
Yeah, and if I'm wrong and there's a monster on here that has counterspell, please comments. Yeah. Let me know. I missed one. There's a lot of monsters in here.
Yeah.
But yeah, usually they get this negate spell ability. So since it is an ability, it's a reaction, this innate spell casting, I'm kind of putting air quotes here. It's the Alhoun targets one creature it can see within 60 feet of it that is casting a spell. If the spell is 3rd level or lower, the spell fails, but any spell slots or charges are not wasted. So if you're unfamiliar with counterspell, usually it works where you cast it at 3rd level. If your spell slot matches the spell being cast, it automatically counterspells it. Nothing else needed.
Yeah. Or if it's lower.
Or if it's lower, yes. But if it's a higher level, then you usually have to roll an Arcana check and try to beat the spell DC, which is 10
it's not
plus
Arcana,
the spell
it's
level.
just a spell casting ability check. So
you're right.
And the DC is 10 plus the spell level. So if you cast a 3rd level counter spell trying to counter a 5th level spell to DC 15,
right,
and you roll your D20, you get to add your spell casting ability modifier to it.
Right. So there was always this game that needed to be played of how high do I need to cast counterspell in order to actually counter this person's ability, which without having to roll. And I've heard a lot of negative things about that interaction. I've heard a lot of negative things about counterspell in general and how it's a very unfun ability. So negate spell definitely makes things less painful. The fact that it is only 3rd level spells or lower means that if you're casting your big spell, you don't have to feel like this is going to get wasted by the enemy counterspelling me. It's just not going to happen. And then even if you do cast something and it gets counterspelled, all that you're wasting is your action, as the spell slots or charges are not wasted anymore.
Right. I mean, and wasting your action is a big deal.
Yep.
But that is a difference. Counterspell, I actually just pulled up because I haven't like actually looked at it in a while. It doesn't specifically say the spellcast spot is wasted, but it doesn't say it's not. So I think the assumption is that it is.
Yeah.
That's how we've always played it.
Yeah, no, that's you cast the spell doesn't work.
Right.
It's
so
like
that always
anything
sucks. Cast your 5th level spell, gets counterspelled. You can't do anything about it. You wasted your turn, your action, and down your 5th level spell slot.
All right, I'm with you. This counterspell was never fun. It's kind of mean. But like intuitively, I look at this negate spell and it's limited to 3rd level or lower, and you don't lose your spell slot. And it's got this like Weenie Hut Juniors kind of feel to it. Like somebody was just too salty about losing a counterspell battle, and they were like, "No more. This can never happen again."
Right.
But it does kind of. I think it. I hate it, but it seems like it's probably the more fun option to go with.
I feel like I must be playing a different game. I love the counterspell battles. Like, that's so fun to me. I love when it's like, I cast a spell and they counterspell, and then somebody else is like, ooh, I'm counterspelling that. And it's like, okay, it's roll off time. You know, like this, like the tension that comes from that, I feel like is always a blast. Even if it results in, I lost my spell slots, like the potential to burn other spell slots because, you know, the enemy's wasting it and whatever. I mean, D&D is a war of attrition in terms of combat. Like, the whole point is I need to have more resources than the other side. So like taking away ways to burn those resources, maybe it is just from a DM perspective, but it's like that makes things weirder to run.
One thing I will say though is the issue was what you were saying was that you could never possibly use all your slots as a high level wizard monster.
Correct.
And that's totally true. No fight.
Yeah.
If this fight goes that long, you could kill 4 parties. The problem is you end up using all of that on counter spells and shields. And that's just not fun.
I don't think you do, because then
why wouldn't you?
Because you're limited by your reaction. And your reaction gives only a shield or a counter spell. So, you know, that's something that you have to choose the right move on. You either do shield because you're about to get hit with a melee attack 30 times.
Every single opportunity you will burn that reaction to do the spell.
That's just good use of action economy. I mean, that's what you need to make a high level monster. Sorry, I'm talking over you. It is obnoxious, but that's... Is it unfun for the players, though? It's like it's difficult. How is that unfun, though?
Because if you counterspell every single time, it's just mean. It's just mean.
I understand that, but I'm saying you won't be able to do shield and counterspell every time. Like, you are limited there. If you make every single monster, or like you got 3 spellcasters and each of them have counterspell, yeah, that's really annoying. And that just gets
that's actually happened.
Quickly.
I've remembered that happening. Yeah. It was just like, this is not fun.
I read that. Yeah. And that got out of hand. I totally get it. I admit it.
I wasn't going to name names.
Out of hand. Yeah. No, it was me. We had this like infinitely recreating Revenant situation going on. Yeah. And they had counterspell. They had the wizard. So you were finding like 4 of these things with counterspell at once. And there was like a wizard and a cleric. They just sat the fight out. It was admittedly not great design. I think I like pulled back on it at the end, but
it was memorable.
Yeah,
I remember how mad I was.
I guess I don't feel like a frustrating, difficult fight is something that should be entirely moved away from. I want the ability to make things difficult, challenging, and in a game about resource management, that means burning resources. And this is taking away a way to burn resources. So, you know, I'm going to have a really hard time on that. And I think there might have been a way to make this better. You know, okay, you don't want counterspell anymore. Fine. Just make it so that if it's 3rd level or lower, it automatically fails. And then if it's higher, then do the roll. You know, and just not make it so that they can upcast their counterspell to 6th level to just burn it easily. It adds an extra layer to things to say, hey, there's a chance that they're going to fail. I mean, their spellcasting ability is what, plus 8, I'm assuming, in this case. I guess it doesn't list it, does it?
Because they have no spell attacks.
Yeah.
The spell save DC is 16.
So it would be proficiency
Probably,
bonus
yeah.
plus their spellcasting ability, though, right?
Yeah. So 8,
Okay, so it's plus 8. So, okay, you cast your level 5 spell. The DC is now 15 if they want to counterspell it, so they have to roll 7 or higher. Like, are they probably going to do it? Yeah, they're a high-level spellcaster. They're good at blocking spellcasters as well. That's how it goes.
Yeah. This is another, I'm being non-committal with this. It's another one where I'm right on the fence about, because as a player, I've definitely just been frustrated and feel like I'm not having fun, where I'm like, I'm about to do the big thing and I describe it and you sit there and let me describe it. And then you go, not counterspell. And you like give me this smirk and I go, oh, okay, I guess that's my turn. And I slump back in my chair and it's like, that wasn't fun. Like, I understand that was harder and stuff. And it's like, but yeah, it's really, we've kind of hit this point where it's like, it needs to, there's like 2 paths D&D can seem to be going down, and it's like one or the other. And like, I could kind of get both of them, and like maybe the ability to switch between them. So I guess it's not like we lose access to Volos and Mordenkainens, and you can just kind of do that depending on our party composition and
you say that, but people do. People who aren't here, like in the future, will not have this. So that's kind of a tangent, but that is probably the most upsetting thing about this book to me, is that it's now legacy. It's not produced anymore. If you're not on the boat, you're never going to have counterspell ever again. You're not going to know the glory of these days of overcoming these challenges.
Well, the players
know the legends.
The players can counterspell, but they have less reason to counterspell because they have less spells now.
Right.
So with less spell casting, there's less reason. It's less of a necessary pick. Right.
And then they can, we kind of hinted at it already, but like the counterspell battles, like Raw, you could counterspell. So I could be casting Disintegrate, and then the monster counterspells me just with the counterspell spell, and I'm going to use my reaction to counterspell that counterspell. So Disintegrate, it can still go off, or someone else can do that, and you can have this big chain. That's what we were kind of talking about. With this, you can't counterspell negate spell, but they can negate spell your counterspell.
Yeah.
Which gets weird.
It makes counterspell even worse.
It does.
Say, because if you because right now that's very much a build, the spellcaster who has counterspell, and there's nothing that prevents you as the caster counterspelling somebody counterspelling you.
Right.
It's like in world, I'm sure it's a little bit awkward because it's like you're speaking your spell, and then they go no spell, and you, while talking about this spell, you say no spell, and
that is it's lore accurate. That's the
that's the incantation. You just go no spell,
no spell.
No spell. But either way, that is a build, and that is something where you as the player, you're getting your big spell ready, and you're like, I'm about to cast my 7th level spell, and you either say, hey, are you within 60 feet? Because I'm going to need you, other spellcaster, to potentially counterspell their counterspell so that I can get this off. Or I need to save my reaction for it. Like, it's not like there's been no ways around it. It's I don't know, in the same way that it's like, disappointing things happen in D&D. The dice don't always like you. That's why we love the game. Sometimes you action surge and you miss every single attack. And we can't just keep ripping these things out of the game until there's only one path, and that's success.
Yeah, that's totally fair. I get that.
So, yeah, I don't know. And then, to totally see your point as well. I'm like, yeah, but it being easier makes the game more accessible, and I like that.
Yeah. And actually, weakening counterspell just hurts players.
Yes.
It does. It makes it harder for players.
Do you think it's just players?
Change. What do you mean?
Well, because negate spell can't be counterspelled, is what we were saying.
Right. So, yeah, that's harder for players, for PCs.
Okay. Right.
And then because then your PCs are now going to be the only things in a battle with the counterspell spell. And it's now overall weaker. that is harder for them. Really, the only kind of nerf I'd say negate spell has is that you don't get the roll for higher levels. It's 3rd level or lower. It's automatic.
Right.
Anything higher doesn't. I think that's the biggest thing about where it could potentially make things easier. But it does so much more, like in the Alhoun specifically, at least, it does so much more damage now that kind of balances out. Like, I don't know if I would say it's getting easier. It's getting easier to run, and there's some less versatility, but the monsters are definitely harder in this. And I know like that there's been design choices made, and like it's been talked about in interviews and stuff like that, where it's like people complaining some of the monsters are too easy and not that deadly, and so they've upped damage, they've upped health, they've upped AC, they've made them harder, and I do see that reflected. So in some ways, it kind of balances out. It's just, or even if it doesn't, in this case, even if the Alhoun is overall easier, they very easily just in a future one, or they could make everything else harder with keeping the kind of the negate spell as is, and overall still have a harder monster.
Yeah, what I'm trying to find, and it's just difficult to comb through and find it right away, is if there is a time where this negate spell is an option that goes higher than 3rd level. Because I think for a challenge rating 10 creature, having negate spell go 3rd level spells and lower makes perfect sense to me. And this is something that, maybe a good way to do this is if you are trying to run a creature like this and you want this negate spell ability, up it to 4th level spells and lower, up it to 5th level spell and lower, depending on the challenge rating and what would make sense. Because challenge rating 10, you're probably fighting a party who's level 7-ish is what I'm going to say. And their highest level spell is 4th level. So you are getting their 2nd highest spell. And that's something that might just need played out a little bit here, is figuring out where that sweet spot is. My guess is going to be like your spell slot just one lower than your highest is probably going to be okay to counterspell. And if it's their absolute highest, that's when it can be really frustrating.
Right. So I think maybe we got too fixated on specifically the Alhoun's negate spell, because other ones do change it. I just pulled up Grez, one of the Demon Lords. He also has a negate spell, which is recharge 5 to 6. So it's not 3 times a day, but infinite. Within 60 feet, spell 3rd or lower automatically fails and has no effect. So it actually does waste the spell slot. You don't get to save it.
Oh, okay.
And then if the spell is 4th or higher, then they do the charisma check against a DC of 10 plus the spell's level. So it is in there. So if you feel like, that's too weak for the Alhoun, then just like put that in there or not. So maybe we did hyper focus on the Alhoun. We did say we were going to use these as examples of greater, and then here we are. But greater design choices.
I'm glad. Okay, so then talking about it from that perspective, I have been too harsh. I think that's okay. It does give you some ways to play around with this, and I think a lot of the initial feelings, mine as well. Like, let's just be completely honest. We are going to have thoughts that we change in 6 months. We always do. Looking at these episodes, the reason we're doing our multi-class Redux, things change. But I think this is like a total change in how the game is played. Not a total change, but it's a pretty big change in how the game is played. And it'll be a little while until we can find the same ways that we used to tweak things.
Mm-hmm.
And change is hard and upsetting.
No like change.
No like change.
And then there is just kind of a negative feeling coming into reading this book and going through it, because it did feel kind of pretty anti-consumer.
Yeah,
which I know is not certainly something we cover, but like releasing it only in a bundle of books that any player who's been around for a while would already have, and then saying rebuy this, and there's nothing new, just retweaked of what you already have, and the previous books that you have are now legacy and not eventually legal, and we're going to try and phase them out. Everything about that did kind of just put a sour taste in my mouth, and I think a lot of people's mouths, and it kind of makes you come into this like just not liking it.
Yeah, like
I think that's totally
issues.
fair, and and there are issues too. So it's kind of hard to navigate all of that.
So enough about the Alhoun. Let's actually go to a different monster. I want to talk about the Demogorgon or Mr. Demogorgon, because this actually has some changes that I really like and think that were very welcome. We talked about with our Demon Lord episodes how many of the Demon Lords felt just not great. I mean, not strong enough, easy to get around, just not great. And there are a lot of changes in here that I think are recognizing those pitfalls of the Demon Lords and making an effort to change it.
Clearly, they listen to our podcast.
Obviously.
Yes.
That's like my favorite running joke, is that like anybody important listens to us at all. Like, oh, we covered a monster, and then Critical Role had it on their episode 2 weeks later. Obviously, Matt Mercer is an enjoyer of the show.
Right.
So looking at the 2 stat blocks, the base information isn't changed much at all. We've got 60 additional HP, and when you're comparing 400 HP to 464 HP, it's nothing massive, but the actual stats themselves, like strength, dex, all of that, stayed the exact same. The first change that we see is in the Tentacle Attack, the multi-attack, and in the older version, in that one's in Mordenkainen's, the Tentacle does bludgeoning damage, whereas the Monsters of the Multiverse, it's going to keep saying Mordenkainen's, and just you all figure out which book I'm talking about. The Tentacle does force damage instead. So we've got a change in the damage types. Instead of the attacks being magical weapons, we instead now have the damage just being force, which I think only affects 1 or 2 scenarios. There's not many player abilities where you get resistance to bludgeoning damage that I can think of besides the Barbarian. Does that sound right?
Mm-hmm.
So that one I'm kind of not loving, because I feel like we have made the Barbarian a bit weaker, which no one's asked for. And when I first mentioned this, I think day 1, I sent something out on Twitter, and people were like, well, if it's only high level monsters, that's fine. And you know what? I'll agree with that. If it was just Demogorgon, then cool. You're right. It should be a difficult fight. Maybe it does get around the Barbarian's rage abilities, and they have to deal with that. But we do actually see it in other monsters as well, and we'll see it with the Caneloth when we take a look at that, changing some damage from bludgeoning or piercing to now force damage. Whether or not it makes sense or is in universe makes sense, force damage to me is always like the magical damage. So I
mean, it is.
Yeah,
like Eldritch Blast does force.
Right. So making
magic missiles,
making a physical thing deal force damage doesn't sit entirely right with me.
Yeah, it's odd. I'm wondering if come 2024 again, when they do the new whatever it is they're doing, if that's going to make more sense. If we're going to see bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing going away, this almost seems why it's doing that.
I don't think it'll be that drastic, because the plan is to make this backwards compatible. So I think if we were going to see that removed, we'd already see it removed. And even in this stat block, looking at the legendary actions, the tail attack can do bludgeoning damage and necrotic damage. So it's not all of their abilities, it's a couple, or just the tentacle really in this case.
Oh, you're right. Okay.
So a little bit messy there as well.
Yeah, I wonder what the logic is. I've been trying to figure that one out, because I know there's a good handful of monsters where this happens on. And I don't get it. I don't get what's the point of making the change.
It makes Heavy Armor Master worse. Though that was only magical damage or non-magical damage. So magic damage or magic weapons, got around that already.
Yeah, because Demogorgon, the Legacy version, has an innate feature where it's all their weapon attacks are magical.
Right.
Just to clarify that. So it's magical bludgeoning, and that it was doing. Now it does not have that anymore. So if it just says bludgeoning, it is just bludgeoning.
Right.
It's not magical.
So
in some ways, then that's better for some things, I guess. I don't know. It just, I don't get it. I don't get it. I don't get what the point of like going through and spending the time to make those changes was.
It really does feel like just a direct blow to the barbarians, who do not need it. Like, that's their thing. Their thing is that they tank damage. Let them tank damage.
Right. The worst part is it's not a direct blow to the barbarians.
No, you're right.
Which those did not need any concessions at all.
Right. They still get resistance to force. Yeah. It's like still anything they don't.
And I saw a lot of people saying that as well. It's like, oh, it doesn't matter. You just play a barbarian. And it's like, that's the worst response I have ever heard.
Everybody just plays the barbarian.
Right. And you know, sure, some people don't because they're not obsessed with the min-maxing aspect of it. But for the people who do play based on min-maxing, we didn't need to give them more reason to go barbarian.
Yeah.
So things I do like about this is
real quick on that. So if anyone has any insight on that design choice, which is all through this book, swapping out magical damage types to just force, let us know. Like, I'm very confused. This one's been eating at me. I've been thinking on it. I don't get it. Anyways, what do you like?
Yes. Yeah. So the things that I do like are the changes to the gaze ability. So the legacy version has Beguiling Gaze, Hypnotic Gaze, and then an Insanity Gaze. So the small name change thing, they just made the Insanity Gaze Confusing Gaze. I'm sure that's just to move away from using things like ableist language. That's totally fine. But they also changed it so that you no longer can look away from the gaze. That was in the legacy version. You could avert your eyes, and that just completely negated every one of the Demogorgon's abilities, as if you just looked away.
Yeah, I think we ripped into that pretty hard in our Demogorgon episode.
Yeah. So that, to me, was a very good change. There was just no reason to limit a CR 26 creature to if your eyes are open. Doesn't matter. It's a magical gaze. It's looking at you. He gets to use his gazes on you.
I missed that change. I'm happy they did that. I wonder if there's others. Not too many things get gaze other than like Medusas or Basilisks, and I don't think they're in specifically this.
I don't think so. That's a monster manual monster, Medusa at least. And Basilisk, both are.
Yeah, they are.
The Hypnotic Gaze was also updated to previously it says target is charmed by Demogorgon until the start of Demogorgon's next turn. Demogorgon chooses how the charmed target uses its actions, reactions, and movement. Because this gaze requires Demogorgon to focus both heads on the target, he can't use his Maddening Gaze legendary action until the start of his next turn. So that second part, that rider, is removed. It basically was saying if they're doing Hypnotic Gaze, that's all that they can do. This is saying, no, that's silly. We're going to take that out because, once again, it's Demogorgon. It is a CR26 creature.
Right.
It is going to be scary.
Definitely. No, I am happy with the changes to Demogorgon because he is supposed to be like the Prince of Demons.
Yes.
And he felt like one of the weaker ones.
Yeah.
Is he also doing more damage? I forgot to check that. No, it's
not directly, but something that you'll notice is under the legendary actions, we now have the cast a spell ability. So it can use 2 of its legendary actions to cast one of its spells, which aren't damage dealers, but would take away from you doing damage. So whereas before, if you wanted to get your Feeble Mind off, that meant avoiding doing your gaze as well as your tentacles, you would just do a spell. Right. And something I didn't even mention, but is a massive change, is that the gaze is now part of the multi-attack as well. So once again, whereas before you would have needed to use your gaze, and that would be the entire turn, that would be its entire action, or legendary action. Now it's able to make a tentacle attack and a gaze attack, or 2 tentacle attacks if they just don't want to use the gaze.
Right. That is great. I love that.
Yeah, so I would say overall that, no damage numbers went up, but the amount of attacks that you'll get in an encounter goes up significantly.
Right. And I always love seeing that in stat blocks where it's the multi-attack where it's like do a regular attack that they have and then one of their special abilities, because it always feels really limiting when you have to pick between them. And with Demogorgon having that, it's amazing. Like I said, I missed kind of a lot of that. I'm assuming there's more in this book with that.
Any of the demon lords you can look over and see a lot of changes of that sort. So it's a bit of a bummer that we just did our demon lords like a couple months ago. Oh well.
Yeah, it happens.
Just gives us more content, right? As we go through them again.
The Demon Lord Redux.
Yes.
The 2022 quarter 1 Demon Lord 2. Now we're doing the 2022 quarter 3 Demon Lord Redux.
Man, it's like
I guess we're only in the second quarter. Yeah.
It's like they didn't even think about how these changes would affect our show.
Right? How are you considerate of them?
The spellcasting otherwise doesn't change. This is not one that, I mean, this was already innate spellcasting, but it can all be counterspelled. Your Feeble Minds can be counterspelled. Your Project Image can be counterspelled. So I'd say overall, the Demogorgon fight is just going to be more difficult and also be smoother to run. So overall, great changes here. Very happy with it. Except for the force damage thing.
I don't even know if I'd say I'm not happy with it. It's just weird.
I want answers.
It has such a minor effect. Unless we're missing something.
Yeah, I mean, I've really been trying to pour over it.
Yeah,
it seems like that's the only thing it does. Nope, I got nothing.
Yeah.
All right, then the next monster, and this kind of goes along with this whole force damage change, is the Caneloths. So this is a lower challenge rating monster. It's CR 8, and changes just kind of, again, the stat block itself are all the exact same. Has the same strength through charisma. It has the same skills, the same damage resistances, immunities. Nothing. Oh, I guess it did get dark vision out to 60 feet. If you've got true sight, I don't know why you also need dark vision, but
120 feet of true sight, 60 feet of dark vision.
Mm-hmm.
What?
No, they removed dark vision.
Yeah, they removed.
Oh, they removed it. I'm so sorry. That makes sense. I was looking at them opposite. Yep.
No, it was just a weird choice for a legacy version.
Yes, and I'm sure that's what somebody saw that and they're like, "How did this get past editing?" All right, we'll change it. But in terms of changes, so once again we get magic weapons removed, and instead what we see now is that the multi-attack, or the attacks themselves, all have force damage added to them or some other type of damage. So the bite, whereas before did 6d6 plus 4 piercing damage, now it does 1d6 plus 4 and then 4d8 force damage. So it's the same amount of damage, but it's doing force damage and no magical attack there.
It's so weird.
And the claws doing the same thing, where the average damage comes out to 16 instead of 15. Big change. But it does 1d6 plus 4 slashing damage plus 2d8 force damage versus 2d10 plus 4 slashing damage. And then the tongue is same damage amounts, but we've got in the legacy 2d12 plus 4 piercing damage, and now we have 1d12 plus 4 plus 2d6 acid damage. So that one, I mean, that's fine. Okay, you want to do acid damage instead of piercing.
That's acidic.
Cool. But what about this creature? This fiend is doing force damage.
And it's so weird. I know I keep saying that. I'm just so baffled by the design choice, especially because one of the clearly stated ideas of this is to make things easier to run and more accessible. Splitting it like this makes it harder.
Instead of rolling
66 or whatever, 68, you have to roll 1d6 plus 4 and then 48, and we got their checkbot resistances.
Yeah, and I'll say that's really hard to keep track of as a DM. So I just had our party fight this a couple days ago, this Caneloth, and we also had Spike devils, I think, accompanying them, and their damage was 1d4 plus 2 piercing and then 1d6 fire damage. And I messed that up like 3 times in the fight where I transposed them because it's confusing. I have to roll 2 different damage die and they do 2 different damage types. It's really not fun to run that way. I would much rather have something be 66 damage.
Yeah. It's so bizarre. Like, I guess it changes up resistances. There are other ways to get resistances than being a raging barbarian. And so it just...
Are there ways that come up often?
No. And force is hard to get.
Force is, yeah, there's like a magic item that gives resistance to force damage.
Right. And isn't there a spell?
There might be.
Also, I think some like the new in like Fizzban's Treasury Dragons, there's various things where you could get like this. I think some of the Dragonborn, I think like the Gem Dragonborn.
Yes, you're right.
Possibly, and I think there's a couple other ways in there you could get force resistance.
Well, obviously, this was just supposed to be a buff to the Gem Dragons. That was the entire point.
I'm wondering if we're going to see different ways to get resistance, more common ways for PCs to get resistance of any damage type of their choice. And they're looking, it's like, all right, there's nothing that gives force. And I don't know. I'm kind of grasping here.
I'm not seeing it. I guess there is something to be said where if they're adding more ways for PCs to get resistance, then adding more variation of damage types is a good thing. And I can agree with that, where damage variation does. I mean, that sounds like a good thing to me. There's like a lot of fire damage. There's a lot of bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing. Force probably didn't need more added because it's so hard to resist and there's no way around it. But yeah. I don't know. I think I'm grasping too, and I felt like I was going somewhere. So I think this doesn't make sense.
No. Well, I don't know. We'll have to see what happens. Like it's not like game breaking. I'm not like mad about it. It's just weird. And it's like, so we'll have to see what happens in the future with new content and revisions, and maybe it'll all click one day.
Yeah, maybe.
It seems too deliberate for it to just be like something that wasn't thought out for a reason.
And I think it's really upsetting that we haven't already been given that information.
Yeah.
That seems like a really bad PR move. This was obviously a bad release. This has been a bad release. You should not release a book and have people say, we need to boycott Wizards of the Coast. We hate this book. We hate what they've done. This was anti-consumer. I mean, like, obviously we're having negative feelings ourselves, but we're not. I'm not telling everybody to go out there and boycott Wizards of the Coast. I don't care what you do, to be honest, but what does my voice matter anyways? So I don't feel like they are doing this properly. They should have gone up ahead and done live streams, opened up these, done what we're doing right now, and say, this is why we made this change. Mm-hmm. These are the 2 creatures. Here's Demogorgon before. Here's Demogorgon afterwards. We noticed that X, Y, and Z wasn't fun, so we changed it to this. And these are the revisions we went through. Like, some transparency would have gone such a long way in helping people understand why we're here.
And then this might just be specific to the Caneloth. I don't think this is a greater design choice, but their tongue attack in the Legacy is a ranged weapon attack with a 30-foot range. And the new one, it's a melee weapon attack with 30-foot reach.
Oh yeah, we actually messed that up too.
Well, yeah, that actually would have mattered.
Yeah,
because we had a monk who thought they didn't realize it was a ranged weapon attack with the tongue, and he could have deflected missiles on it and didn't. And so you could deflect missiles on the old one, and now this one, because it's a melee weapon attack with a 30-foot reach, you can't. You could also do an opportunity attack from the tongue. When
that's a huge change, actually.
There's more of that. That one's like a subtle one that's easy to miss.
Because there was multiple times where you all got out of its range, and I couldn't do... It got out of the 30-foot range, and I couldn't do the melee weapon, or I couldn't do the tongue attack. And honestly, I was happy that I couldn't. That seemed like it was too much. A 30-foot range that this thing can lock down with a attack that did 17 damage and then grappled and restrained.
And pulled you in,
And pulled you in 30 feet. It's like a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah. So that might, I don't think that's a greater design choice. That might just be specific to the Caneloth, but it's definitely a boost to the Caneloth because like that makes it very hard to run away from.
Yeah, and it means monks can't deflect missiles on it, which is like, that's game breaking.
Yeah, and that, sure.
Has there been a larger change to 5th edition since it's come out? I mean, that would be like if they made nets not have disadvantage when thrown. Just be too much. People couldn't handle it. But I think, I mean, I'm sure going to be more changes and such that come up. And I feel like it's going to be fun from our perspective of how we handle monsters going forward. Because
I'm thinking like, for monster episodes going forward, if it's in this book, we'll probably reference both and kind of continue talking about this in future monster episodes.
That's a really good point for at least a little bit here. Because otherwise, I feel like if we just completely stop talking about Mordenkainen's and Volos, like I'd be a little upset because I'm only going to use those books. I mean, not only, but I feel like I'm mostly going to stick with those.
Right.
Or not. Maybe I'll be converted.
Yeah.
I'm glad.
It's over. It's over.
I'm glad that we're going to continue the conversations because I feel like we will become more comfortable with the design decisions as we kind of figure it out and play with them. So we'll do some testing.
Right. Yeah, but I think that's it for this episode. Just kind of the big design changes for the monsters. Obviously, we didn't really touch races. We usually don't cover those on this show. It's a lot of subtle changes, divorcing ability scores from it, which I think's nice.
Which we've talked about when Tasha's came out.
Tasha's, yeah. So we were really planning on covering that stuff in detail. I don't remember if you said that at the beginning, but
I don't know. But if people are super interested in it, let us know.
We could do a separate episode.
Yeah, I'm worried that it would turn into us going through each change and basically saying like, yes, good, no, bad. Like, not really much nuance to it. For the most part, I was pretty happy with the changes, though. It is good.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess the one general thing I would say is new races that come out are pretty strong compared to a lot of the old ones. So the fact that these kind of got re-put through the more modern design and kind of buffed up to match, I think is really great.
Yeah, though it does feel weird because now things like, I won't say hill dwarves are underpowered. I'll never say that. But older races like original Player's Handbook races that haven't been reprinted didn't get this. And that feels a little bit weird to me. Like if you were going to go through and just update all of the extra races, then you might as well update all of the original ones as well. Humans need some love.
Yeah. Might be coming.
Maybe. But what's definitely coming is our promotional bit that covers me discussing The Crafty Gamer. The Crafty Gamer is a place where you can go to get D&D themed loot or just merchandise. Things like candles, soaps, t-shirts, and other things, and you can get 10% off your order using the code MM10. Get yourself some Paladin soap so that you can smell virtuous.
It's a really nice smell.
Yeah.
It's just kind of like, I don't know, whenever I use it, I just like smell myself all day. It's like, yeah.
I'm better than most people. That's the true scent of a paladin.
Yes.
And thank you, as always, to our patrons. Your continued support makes us very, very happy. And if you want to support the show, you can go to monstersmulticlass.com/support, where you can find our Patreon, where you can get access to episodes early, a day early, usually, sometimes more, who knows. And also find our other affiliates. Go there. But our patrons are Ed G, Muddawait, Brian H, Craig A, Isaac M, Jeff W, Luca L, Star Shinobi, Vincent M, Bob F, Joe P, Rick D, Sensible D20, Tyler S, Adam A, and Rob K. Thank you all, as usual. You are amazing.
And as always, thanks for watching.